I asked Dee this morning, I said, where's that brochure? I need to know how much time I have for the seminar. And I looked, and it was an hour and 15. Is Mr. Blackwell here? He's not here. He's the one who set up the schedule, and he probably knows not to show up. Because I was going to ask him, who are you trying to wear out, me or them? Well, I like words. I use words a lot. Have to. I mean, it's in some aspects, it's part of my job. You use words a lot. Some of you use a lot of words. A lot. Often when I'm writing, I'll spend a lot of time, sometimes just on one word, trying to find the exact word, the exact right word to convey the thought that I want to convey. Words are important because words are what we use to take something that's in our mind and try to get it in the mind of somebody else. And it's the only thing that we can use, spoken or written. I guess this is my weekend for oldies, because the Bee Gees had an old song back then, back in the 60s, called Words. Remember that song by the Bee Gees, Words? There's a line in it that I just loved. It said, "It's only words, but words are all I have to take your heart away." It's a great line conveying that I'm trying to find the right words to express to you how I feel. And that's all I have to use. And that's what we have in so many cases. How many of you have ever had a problem expressing yourself to somebody? And what do you say when that happens? I'm at a loss for words. You know what you're thinking, but it's like, I'm trying to find how to say it. Have you ever used the wrong words? Or said something that was misunderstood? Ever offended somebody? Ever been offended by somebody's words? Then you find out later, well, that's what I blurted out, but that's not what I meant. We can have that. Words aren't always clear either. They can be and often are misunderstood. I think I've learned in life to occasionally in a conversation stop and ask people, what do you mean? Tell me how you're defining this word before we go any further. Because otherwise we can take this conversation down a road that you never intended for it to go down. I'm going to give you an example. Are you liberal or conservative? That's a good place to stop right there and say, let's have a definition. Are we talking about politics? Are we talking about finances? Are we talking about morals? Are we talking about generosity? Before I answer that, because I could answer that, and we could go start butting heads real quick on something that you may not even intend. Let's make sure I understand the word you're using, why you're using that word, and what you mean by that word is what I mean by that word. Even words we know well sometimes have different connotations to different people. And we often have our own go-to definition of a word. And as soon as we hear it, we say, well, this word means this. And sometimes we can limit our own understanding or miss out on certain aspects and nuances that could lead us to a deeper understanding of something. Let's take the word we're going to explore today, fellowship. I'd like for you to do something for me real quick. It's going to be real short. Take about a minute and write your definition of leadership, of fellowship. What is your definition of fellowship? I'll give you enough time until I get impatient. What is your define fellowship? Okay, time's up, whatever time it was. Is anybody willing to share their definition with the group? Yes.
Getting to know someone.
Getting to know someone, okay? Yes, back here.
Conversation with others of like mind to strengthen and uplift each other.
Conversation with others of like mind to strengthen and uplift each other. Anybody else? Yes.
Sharing our lives.
Sharing our lives.
Being together.
Being together, yes. Talking with someone or a group of people who are your friends, yes. Okay, interacting with love and compassion, intent on edifying the person. Take one more. Yes, back there. Interaction of friends and friendship. You see, all of those are right, but there's such different nuances. We're focused on different things. They could all go together in a dictionary and all blend together, but none of them captured the entirety of what necessarily others were thinking. All of them were correct, but there were various nuances and shade of meaning. There's another interesting thing about words, too, and sometimes that's the etymology of the words. The origins, where they came from. Sometimes we understand words better if we understand how they came to be in our language. How did it come to mean this or that? You know, this weekend I got to thinking about words because two of the key words that we're using at this weekend end with the syllable ships. Ships. Friendships, relationships. Got to thinking about that. What does that mean? Where did that come from? And there are other related words to those. Kinship, discipleship, partnership, citizenship, membership, sportsmanship. Where did this syllable of ship come from to be attached to English words today? I know what a ship is, but I don't think that's what it means. I mean, do we say, well, fellows, that's a bunch of guys, and ship is a boat, so it's a bunch of guys who say we're all in the same boat together, you know. I guess you could stretch it that way, but I don't think that's what it means. So I looked it up, and the definition is that ship is a word-forming element. It's not a word, not in that way, but it's a word-forming element. It's not a word itself, but when you add it to another word, it creates a new word. And it means quality, position, relation between, or the Old English was a condition of being. So you add some of those other words in front of ship, friend, relation, kin, partner, citizen, member, so on. And you form a new word that describes the condition of being, the quality that exists in that particular group. If it's citizens, the citizenship is supposed to relate to the quality of the being of the group of citizens that you have. The membership of the club, something like that. It's very interesting how these things come about. The word particularly of interest for this seminar is a word that we often find in the Bible, fellowship. Where did that come from? It's a little richer when you understand it. The word fellow goes back to the 1200s. It's the Old English theologa, which meant partner, one who shares with another. But that English word came from an Old Norse word, which was the philagi. And that was made up of two words, which is very interesting. Fe in Norse meant money, and lag meant to lie down. They used two words, money and lie down, but think about it. The etymology of fellow seems to have originated with one who puts down his money with another in a joint venture. One who puts down his money with another in a joint venture. Now, by the 1300s, it came to mean one of the same kind. And we have a version of that exists till today. We talk about our fellow man. And what we mean by that is all humanity. One of the same kind. By the 1500s, it came to mean any man or male person. And that's how we use it today to a great extent in some uses. If you talk about all the fellows in the room, we know it's the men. And, we got fellows and girls. But if you talk about fellowship, nobody here thinks about, well, that's about the men's relationship in the church. We don't think of that. And that's because the word itself is not masculine. Even back in the 1500s, it wasn't. There's a very interesting use in the Bible of this. Now, this is what I'm giving here is a little trivia, but it's going to lead to a point. In the translators of the King James Bible in the 1500s translated Judges 11:37, which is the story of Jephthah's daughter. And that story, the way they translated, there's a verse there, if you read it in the King James, says, she said to her father, let me alone 2 months, that I may go up and down upon the mountains and bewail my virginity, I and my fellows. Now, what did she mean by that? She and all the guys in town were going to go to the mountains, and bewail her virginity? No, although some of the guys might have. In the New King James, though, it was translated, my friends and I. My friends and I. But in the Old King James, back in the 1500s, they said, my fellows and I. Because it was not a masculine thing, it was both. Now, that's just our English, but it's sort of interesting how things evolve that way. We come to the Bible, and fellowship, of course, was used long before we had English. And what we read in the Bible was written in Greek. I guess probably most languages have a word that describes the condition of being that exists among groups of people. But since the New Testament was written primarily in Greek, our interest is in what was it in their language? What did it mean? And just like English, we learn a lot deeper things when we look up words like this. Primarily, the New Testament word for fellowship that is used is koinonia, 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 I should say, koinonia. And it means that which is shared in common. That which is shared in common. Now, in the common Greek, in its usage, koinonia could be used to refer to a number of different things. In the everyday Greek language, it could mean joint participation, the share that you might have in something, a gift jointly contributed, a collection, a contribution. It is used in Greek in everything from business partnerships to communal needs to even sexual relations. It's sort of a wide-ranging word. But in the Bible, in the New Testament, koinonia has a much more narrow range of meaning. The key is that koinonia points us toward the common ground shared between 2 or more people. The common ground shared between 2 or more people. As Christians, the use in the Bible directs us to that fellowship is centered around, based upon, what we have in common. What is it that we have in common? Now think about it. I'm looking at a lot of people here. I did not know any of you before we came into the church. How many of you knew 10 people in this room before you set foot in the church? No hands. 1. How about that? Before you came to church, you knew 10 people. Good. That's amazing. How many knew 5? 1? Maybe 5 hands. Very few of us. What we had in common that brought us here was not our circle of friends. The thing that all of us had in common that brought us here was God. It's the only thing that we had in common. Well, maybe we had in common a few other things, but what was essential to putting us in our seats here today was God. And when we look at God's people around the earth, that's what we have in common. What we have in common And fellowship meaning the common ground shared between two or more people. This tells us something important about fellowship. We start with God. It starts with God. It's easy to think of fellowship as the interactions that we have with each other. That's part of it. That's an end result of it. But that's not the basis of fellowship. Our fellowship is more than that. Our shared belief in God, our desire to obey Him and to follow Him is what makes fellowship possible in the first place. Without that shared common ground, true Christian fellowship is not possible. Just not possible. We can talk with people who don't believe in God. And we do, maybe easily. We can get along with other people who aren't even interested in obeying God. Probably many of you have to do that every day at work. You get along, but you can never have true godly fellowship with them. It's impossible if you don't share God. I was talking with somebody yesterday. We were talking about old times in the past, and they said, you know, one of my friends from way back in pre-95, back in worldwide days, contacted a bunch of us recently and said, let's all get together. He said, there's part of me that wants to, but there's a part of me that from the past knows we don't have anything in common anymore. They've gone their way. They have no interest in how I live, what I believe, how I practice. In fact, some of them disdain it. Some of them dislike it. And so we could get together, but what do we have in common? The thing that brought us together in the first place doesn't exist anymore. And so there can be a relationship, but you can't have the fellowship. That type of fellowship and what it means, the essence of it. We don't share the same common ground when it comes to our purpose for being, our goals in life, the way we want to live. That's the essence of it. Let's go to 1 John 1:3 and see what this scripture says, because it's very enlightening. John starts off by saying that, he said, I'm sharing what we have seen with our eyes, what we looked on, what our hands handled concerning the word of life. He said, whatever we've been through, I'm sharing that with you. And he said in verse 3, that which we have seen and heard, we declare to you, that you also may have fellowship with us. And truly, our fellowship is with the Father and His Son, Jesus Christ. Tells us something really important about our fellowship. Truly, it begins with the Father and Jesus Christ. And then all of these other things that we said, talking with, visiting with, sharing with one another, that's an outflow of our fellowship with Jesus Christ. This is fellowship, godly fellowship in its simplest terms. Your faith in God leads you to pursue a closeness with Him, a fellowship with Him. That's the first place we start. The one we want a fellowship with is with God. How many of you are the only one in this room who wants a fellowship with God? No, you want it. You're working for it. But you look around and you say, well, I'm not the only one who's developing a fellowship with God. Everybody else in here is too. There are others who are drawing close to God. And by drawing close to God, you will also draw close to others who are trying to draw close to God. Others who are having a fellowship with God, that's the nature of the way it works. And it's amazing how it works because it's a spiritual thing. If you could go to Zambia for the feast this year, like I was in 2019, and go there and camp out for 8 days with 170 other people who speak a different language, and you're sitting there with an interpreter communicating with them, people you've never met who you have so little in common with. you would connect spiritually. You would have a spiritual connection. You could talk to them about things that you both understand, that you're both striving for, that you both relate to. You could talk with these people in Zambia you've never met about the fellowship with God in ways that you could not talk with your neighbor over the backyard fence that you've known for 50 years. There is something about that fellowship with God. Let's go to John 1. I'm wondering if I meant 1 John 1. Yeah, I'm sorry. We were supposed to stay in 1 John. See, words are important. If you don't put that 1 in front of the word, it changes everything. 1 John 1 and verse 6. If we say we have fellowship with him and walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. We can't claim to have a fellowship with God and then walk a different way that God walks and say we have fellowship. It's a lie. That ain't right. Doesn't work. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, okay, if we're walking in the light, if that fellowship with God comes first and we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another because the person sitting over here is also trying to walk in the light and you're trying to walk in the light and you're both looking to God, and that puts you on the same page as each other. You understand the same thing, working for the same thing. And the blood of Jesus Christ, his son, cleanses us from all sin. It's really important. Remove God from the picture, and you remove the fellowship. Remove God from the picture, and you remove the fellowship. Fellowship unites us as God's people with a common goal, common focus, common purpose. Now, if fellowship then, I hope I've established that fellowship is the common ground we share as disciples of Jesus Christ. Our next priority then is to figure out, how does God want us to share that common ground? How can we share and develop that common ground? This is a good question to ponder. What are the possible ways? Is there only one way? 2 ways? How many ways are there to cultivate our fellowship with God, with one another? How can we plow, plant, cultivate the common ground that we have to be even more effective? Is fellowship cultivated only when we spend time with one another? That was one of the definitions. It's a good definition, but it's only part of it. Is that the only way fellowship is developed? Or are there other things to it? How many of you are planting a garden this year? I figured in this part of the country there's a lot of that, for sure. How many of you got your potatoes in the ground already? Oh, yeah. Well, they're in Texas. We can do that a little earlier than everybody else. Why are you planting a garden? What's your reason for planting a garden? Well, if you're like me, I like to eat. It's pretty simple. Gardens produce food. I like food. Well, we want good food, too. We want nourishment. And actually, I think most of gardeners enjoy the process of getting out and working the soil and doing all of that. You know, sometime in early June, probably, when you put a couple of pieces of fresh sourdough and you lightly toast it, and you get out and you slather some mayonnaise on it, and you cut about a 3/4 inch slab of that big red big boy tomato, and you sprinkle some salt and pepper on it, and you bite into that, and the aroma just goes up your nostrils. It runs down your chin, the juice, and you say, I don't care, I'll mop that up later. And your taste buds just start popping. You know, sometimes I go to the feast and I go to nice restaurants and I eat steak and fish and all that stuff. And by the time 8 days later, I just want to go home and have a plate of beans and tomatoes. You know, I just want something simple. And boy, but that tomato sandwich that comes straight out of the garden, you just picked it. Your eyes roll back in your head. How good it tastes. Now we are talking. As Jerry Clough used to say, I bet some of you here, he done flung a craving on me. It's so satisfying. A couple of years ago, Dee and I had dinner one night. We were sitting there eating and said, you know what, babe? We produced this whole plate by ourselves. We were eating backstrap from a deer I shot out at Steve and Jonna Barnett's. We had squash, okra, and a tomato cucumber salad that came out of our garden. I said, everything here, we did ourselves, you know, and all of a sudden it tasted better. You know? There's just something gratifying about that. But when you look at that end result, if you stop and think about it, you think a whole lot of work went into this. To get this end result, you go back to February and you start thinking about all the work that went in to preparing that. What kind of effort, time, and work goes into producing the fruits of fellowship? Make a list of everything you have to do to prep and maintain and cultivate the ground of your garden, and then do a spiritual parallel, and it's no different when we're cultivating the common ground of our relationships with one another in the body of Christ through this thing that we call fellowship. And fellowship is really important. Now, if we had time, it'd be fun to break into small groups, about 8 or so, and sit around and brainstorm and try to come up with all the things that go into cultivating fellowship, ways to develop it. It's good to think like that sometimes. But we don't have the time here, so I'm going to give you several ways to enhance and build the fellowship of the body of Christ, to cultivate that common ground that we have. That starts with our relationship with God, but then goes out to others who are also developing the same fellowship with God. Number one, fellowship is cultivated first by loving as Christ loved. Learning to love as Christ loved. Now, I'll tell you what, this is a lifelong process. You're going to be chasing it until the day you die. But the chase means we keep learning and getting better at it. On the final evening of his human life, Jesus gave his disciples a solemn instruction. He said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another." Now, that part was not new, because you can go back in the Old Testament and find that statement. What was new, though, he explained, "As I have loved you, you also love one another. By this, all will know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another." That's in John 13, verses 34 and 35. There are a great many things that ought to make us unique as the followers of Christ. We could say, well, the Sabbath is a sign of God's people. It's a sign, and not of everybody, but it is a sign. But Jesus here said that by this all will know that you're my disciples. That is a defining characteristic. The trait that will make our identity obvious to people is that we should love one another as he loved us. We're not talking about just any kind of love. Love as I have loved you. Take a look around at people here. Just take a look around, in front of you, beside you. How did Christ love that person you're looking at? How did Christ love that person? How does he love that person? How does God love that person beside you, down the row, ahead of you? That's how I'm supposed to love you too. That's how I'm supposed to love you, the way he loved you. That's his relationship. That's his fellowship with that person. And that's how mine's supposed to be. And I look at that and think, ooh-wee. When I was in high school, I pole vaulted track and field. And we went to a big track meet at Texas A&M, biggest stadium I'd ever been in. Walked in there, it seats 50,000 people, and it was a huge track meet. And I wasn't but an average pole vaulter. And the day stretched out, and it stretched out, and our event kept getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. And by the time it started, they said, well, we're running late, so we're going to open the vaulting today for the Division 5 high schoolers at 13 feet. I won't tell you how high I'd pole vaulted then. In college, I got to 13 feet, but at that time, I was about 2.5 feet below it. And I looked up at that and said, that bar is so high, I don't know if I can kick it off. My goal became, can I just get up high enough to kick it off the standard? Much less go over it. And I look at this and say, man, love each other just as I have loved you. That's a pretty high bar. That's a pretty high bar. That same evening, Jesus elaborated a little bit more, and he said in John 15:12-14, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. You are my friends if you do whatever I command you. So you want to be friends with God? I do, and you do too. I know we all want to be friends with God, but he said, you're my friends if you do what I command you. If we have a fellowship with God, we're going to be doing what he wants us to do. He does what we want him to do, right? He does everything we want God to do. He's there. He does everything right. But he wants us to, too. And part of that is to have a willingness to get up to that greatest height possible. In athletics, they have a term, some of you will know, some of you won't because you're not interested in it, but it's called, you always go for a PR. You always go for a PR in athletics. Personal record. You're always trying to go a little better, a little faster, a little higher than you've ever been before. Because that's how you improve. And we have spiritual PRs, where we want to do better than we did last year. And as life goes by and we keep going higher and higher, but the greatest love of all is not like Whitney sang back in the 60s. The greatest love of all is to love yourself. No, it isn't. That's what creates the biggest problems. The greatest love of all is to love God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. And to be able to lay down one's life for his friends. Our friendship, our fellowship with Christ has to be reflected by our love for each other. 1 John 3, verse 16. By this we know love. Another classic song, Foreigner. I want to know what love is. Great song. I like that song. I want to know what love is. I want you to show me. No, we sing a little different version. I want to know what love is. I want God to show me. And he does. He said, by this we know love. You want to know what love is? Because he laid down his life for us. Okay, now that's the standard. And we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. Boy, then if we have that mentality, you talk about a bond, a fellowship. You talk about something that is strong, that melds and welds people together in a brotherhood. When people are willing to lay down their lives for each other and to give of themselves, that'd be amazing. But that's what Jesus was always doing. Now, he laid down his physical life in death one time, but he was always laying down his life in other ways. He was serving. He was out there helping. He was giving. He was sacrificing. He set the ultimate example of what godly love looks like in action. And he modeled the way that we can follow. Now, let's be clear, this is the goal. We are, though, humans, and we won't always act the way Christ acted. And to hold each other to the high bar, but to not hold ourselves to it so much is something that we can't do. With that's not fellowship. We're all human. We all mess up. We fall short. But that kind of love is the goal. That is the goal. It's not always easy. Certainly doesn't come naturally, but that's the goal of fellowship. Love is less of a feeling, far less of a feeling than it is an action. We see that love in the way we act. It's by the choices we make, choosing, as Christ did, to do the right things. Jesus said, he asked one time, if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? He said, do not tax collectors do the same? If you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? He said, therefore be perfect, be mature. Be mature as your Father in heaven is perfect, is mature. It's a lot of the time, I think we can all say that we share this struggle, that our human instinct sometimes is to respond to certain situations with something less than love. And it's in those moments that we have to stop and make the conscious choice to think a different way. Paul explained love in 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians 13. And he explained here, this is really, it's behavior. It's not the way we feel. There are emotions with love. Of course, there are feelings with love. But it's expressed in behaviors and actions. He said, if I speak with the tongues of men and angels, but do not have love, I become as a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could move mountains, but I don't have love, I'm nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not love, it profits me nothing. Every now and then we read in the news of somebody over in the Middle East who gives his body to be burned or blown up, but he doesn't have love, and so he's going to go to Muslim heaven and have however X number of girlfriends up there, but he doesn't have love, and it's nothing. On the International Leadership Program, I have a session to give there called Speaking to the Whole Congregation. And it's a session about developing our speaking and how to reach everybody in the congregation. And one of the points that is in that presentation is that you have to love the whole congregation in order to reach the whole congregation. And there's a big difference between loving to preach and loving the people you preach to. There's a big difference between loving to preach and loving the people you preach to. And that's very important. And Paul said, otherwise, all you are is just like a big old cymbal on a drum set. Ting, 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 just making a lot of noise, because that's all it counts for. Further, Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 16, let all that you do be done with love. High bar, all that you do. We can't negotiate with God. How about 2/3 of what I do? Half? No, he said, let all that you do. So this is the measure. It's the goal. That's why it's so important to pray about this, to think about it regularly. An important part of growing to be more like Christ is learning to love the way he loves us. And by putting it into practice by laying down our lives for others when we have opportunity. Now, we're going to go on to 6 other keys, but all of them really flow from this one. The other 6 really are, I guess you could say in ways, just expressions of love. Point number 2, fellowship, the common ground of fellowship is cultivated by seeking the good of others. Having a mindset of seeking the good for others, just simply looking for ways to help other people. 1 Corinthians 10:24. 1 Corinthians 10:24. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. Again, that's a pretty high bar. Let no one seek his own, but each the other's well-being. What would happen if you have a group of people that operates 100% that way? I think everybody's needs would be taken care of. Everybody would be helped. It reminds me of an old Jewish parable. I think it's Jewish. When I heard it, it was. It's put that way. That all the townspeople in this one town were invited to the castle of the rich man who lived on the mountaintop. They were invited for a feast, and they were sat down in this huge dining hall with a table that ran forever, and everybody is gathered around, and they bring out this feast, wonderful soup and main course, and it's put in front of everybody, and it was the finest food they'd ever had. And then they brought the utensils to eat with, and everybody got a fork and a spoon that was 4 feet long, and you could only grip it at the end. So they were given their utensils, and they're trying to eat. And of course, they can't get their food, or if they can get part of it, they can't get it to their mouths. And so they started getting frustrated. And finally, somebody asked the host, "Why did you do this?" And he said, "Because I wanted to see if you would learn. The key to enjoying this meal is to use your fork and spoon and feed the other person. Use it to feed the other person, and everybody will be taken care of." Godly fellowship is impossible when we think solely of our own needs, if we're looking out for number one. But it flourishes when we each make the effort to focus on the needs and wants of the other. Philippians chapter 2. Philippians 2. Therefore, verse 1, if there is any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit. There we are. Fellowship of the Spirit. Fellowship that's on the spiritual plane. Not the fellowship of the fans of the Kansas City Chiefs. I mean, there's a certain bond there, but that's a bond that's, really shallow. It's fun, but it's just entertainment. But the fellowship of the Spirit is life-changing. If there's any of this, if any affection and mercy, fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each other esteem others better than himself. We're talking about some whole other subjects that could be developed on their own. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. This key of fellowship, cultivating this ground, requires the mindset that if we can develop a mindset that defaults to where we start automatically thinking, what can I do to help? What can I do to help? When we see things and say, okay, how can I help? Can I help? If I can help, how? And is this within my sphere of influence to be able to help in some way? How can I make things better? The more we take time to think about what we can do for each other, the more we begin to function not just as individuals in our relationship with God, but as a body, as the body of Christ. And how is that body described? Ephesians, a couple of pages back, Ephesians 4, verse 16. Ephesians 4:16 talks about the members in the church growing up to be like Christ. And verse 16 says, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies. Now, every joint can't supply everything, but every joint can supply something. And if each joint is of a mind that, hey, I'm going to give what I can give, when I can give it, to whom I can give it, each according to the effective working by which every part does its share, what does that do? It causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. There's a certain spiritual growth. There's a type of spiritual growth that comes from fellowshipping. The body gets built. The body is strengthened. I think we've seen this over the decades. I look back 20, 30 years ago, 40, 50 years ago, I try to measure things, and I think we see a church that has matured a lot. It's got a lot of veterans who have learned, sometimes the hard way, sometimes through education, but we've learned, and younger generations come up, and they're influenced more by people who learn. I was talking with Dave Trebig the other night. We came to the church in '63, and the Houston church had been in existence for 7 years. And when my mom and dad and I walked in and we started hearing people's stories, you think, they've been in the church 7 years. Man, they're a grizzled old veteran. Today we look at somebody who's been in the church for 7 years and think, oh, you're still a babe, you know. But through those years, I mean, we look at the church now and we're not looking at a group of people who's been around for 7 years. We're looking at people who've been around all their lives, decades. And they've learned and they're still here and they're growing and they're here because they've been living this, striving. You don't last 50 years, 40 years, 30 years faking it. But when you're sincerely doing this, you find people who are edifying the body. And a lot of that growth of the body, the edifying of itself, has come from joints being supplied by the effective working of others. That type of fellowship strengthens the body so much. It's such an incredible thing. It comes from thinking about others and supplying that. Point 3, fellowship is cultivated by bearing one another's burdens. I talked about this yesterday, of course. I did not go to Galatians 6 yesterday, but in Galatians 6, it's interesting, in the space of a few verses, Paul gives what sounds like contradictory advice. He says in verse 2 that we should bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Then a few verses later in verse 5, he says something that looks like the exact opposite. Everyone shall bear his own load. Well, what does that mean? Bear one another's burdens, but everyone bears their own load. A man named David De Silva wrote a book called The Letter to Galatians, and he commented in there that by burdens, Paul is talking about both moral and personal failures in verse 1, and just the burdensome experiences of life, the trials of life. He's talking about both of these things. And believers are to extend their love and kindness and support, and as needed, even material things, to help those under those kinds of burdens, the trials of life, the difficulties in life. And he also notes that back at that time, in that culture that Paul was writing to, carrying somebody else's burden was the job of a slave. It was the job of a slave when, a slave was available. If you had a slave, they carried your burdens. And he talks, though, in chapter 5, verse 13, you, brethren, have been called to liberty. Hey, I'm free. Only do not use your liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. And the word serve here is a Greek word that refers specifically to serving as a slave. It was a voluntary thing. You can go back to Deuteronomy 15, I think it is, when the law of the indentured servants. And there's a section there that says, at the end of the 7th year, when the indentured servant goes free, you're supposed to set him up and help him to be able to step away and make it on his own so he doesn't go back into indentured servitude. But it gives this caveat. It says, but if he says to you, because he loves you and your house, I will not leave you. I want to serve in your house forever. You take an awl and you take his ear and you put it against the doorpost and you punch a hole in his ear, and that becomes a sign then that you talk about pierced ears, ladies? You men who would never think of piercing your ear, well, that's what they did. It put a hole in the ear, and it was there permanently, and it was a sign to anybody who saw it that told them that person volunteered to be a servant for life because he loved the master. When we love our master well enough, we volunteer to become a slave for life. We've been freed from sin so that we can become slaves of righteousness. It's an amazing thing. When you look at the Greek doulos, and there are several words for servant or slave in the Bible, in the New Testament, but that word doulos had a connection to the same thing, the same principle in the Old Testament. Someone who voluntarily. Paul said, I am an apostle and a servant of Jesus Christ. An apostle was his job. A servant is what he chose to be. I am a slave. I am voluntarily a slave. All the others, writers, also said that same thing. I am an apostle, that's my responsibility, but more important than my job is I voluntarily became a slave. This is what I want to do. Have you volunteered to be a servant to God, a lifelong slave? To do, well, part of that is to pick up the burdens of other people. Part of it is to carry the loads of others, to serve in that way. Part of that is a willingness to lend a hand when we see others struggling under the weight of life's burdens. Jesus asked, who's greater, he who sits at the table or he who serves? Isn't it he who sits at the table? Well, yeah. But he said, I come to you as the one who serves. A fellowship with God means taking on the same thinking, the same mind. And that same mind then means, okay, that same mind means I'm going to serve. So Galatians 6 is telling us, yeah, there are some loads, you bear one another's burdens, and then each person must carry their own load. That tells us there's a balance between individual responsibility and community responsibility. We as a community, we have a responsibility to each other. Of course, though, if you're an individual in need, you can't just sit back and say, okay, you're supposed to be helping me. I'm not going to do anything. You're supposed to bear my load now. Come on. I need some money. I need some time. I liked it that you helped me this week. I expect you back next Sunday at 8 o'clock. No, we don't abuse the privilege. We have to bear our own load too. There's an individual responsibility of coping with my own problems. But the issue is we have a problem. I've got to deal with my problem, but where you can, we're to help each other with their problems as well. Next point, fellowship is cultivated by sharing material blessings. Fellowship is cultivated by sharing material blessings. So much of what we've been talking about has to do with an attitude, with an approach. But sometimes the physical comes in. From almost the moment the New Testament church started, fellowship was linked to sharing physical blessings. After Peter's sermon on Pentecost, says those who gladly received his word were baptized, and that day there were 3,000 added. And the Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved. Acts chapter 2. Verse 41 talks about that. And then in verse 47, the Lord added those who were being saved. Thousands had gathered in Jerusalem to observe Pentecost. Now, normally they would go home as soon as it was over. back to their houses. But the message they had heard that day was life-changing. And the identity of Christ and God's plan for salvation, and they weren't ready to leave. I mean, something had happened, and they weren't ready to go anywhere. And it says in verse 42, so they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and what? Fellowship, in the breaking of bread and in prayers. Now, this was a temporary state of affairs, of course. There was no way the church could exist forever in this configuration. As it says in verse 46, they'd go to the temple and then breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart. But at least for some time after the church began, God's people experienced a constant and profound level of fellowship. What made it possible? How could they just physically do this? How could they physically manage to do this? Well, it says in verse 44, all who believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods and divided them among all as anyone had need. An amazing time. These early believers had an incredible willingness to share with each other. Now later we read in chapter 4 in verse 32, now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. This wasn't a church ruling. This was something that just flowed out of the hearts of people. This was just a reaction that they had. It was amazing. Now, as the church grew and congregations were established around the world, it was impossible for people to be together in the same way as those early days in Jerusalem. But the idea of being with one heart and one soul, and of, because of that, voluntarily sharing what someone had, that was something that was established and rooted, and it remained a very important thing in the church. When the Corinthian church congregation was preparing to contribute a collection for some of the needy people, Paul gave them some really important insights to this aspect of fellowship. 2 Corinthians 8. 2 Corinthians 8. Verse 12. Yeah, I've got to hurry. If there's first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. We all have various things. But God says, what I'm looking for is the willing mind, because that's where the fellowship with God comes in. God has a willing mind. Christ had a willing mind. So if the readiness is there, God's not so concerned about the monetary values we have or the possessions we have. He wants to see our willingness to share. He talks about in chapter 9, giving as we purpose in our heart, because God loves a cheerful giver. Whether it's giving an offering on a holy day or giving an offer to rake the widow's leaves next Sunday, God is looking and loves the cheerful heart. That's one thing so important to him. Next by the way, let me point out this out. In 2 Corinthians 8, verses 13 through 15, you can read that whole section there. For time's sake, I won't. In chapter 9, in verse 13, he called this gift their liberal sharing. What is interesting about that is, guess what the Greek word is for sharing? It's koinonia. The same word as fellowship. It's the same word. That tells us that sharing and fellowship is connected. It's how we build these bonds. The next point, we come now to one of the most difficult aspects and elements of fellowship. And that is considering that the common ground of fellowship is also cultivated by correcting and forgiving one another. The ground of fellowship is cultivated by correcting and forgiving in love. In love. In a perfect world, we would all do things correctly, wouldn't we? There would never be any mistakes, misunderstandings, bad decisions. We would do the right thing all the time. But we're not in a perfect world, and we're not perfect. And sometimes those imperfections have to be corrected. Again, correction is probably one of the most difficult aspects of fellowship. And at the same time, it's one of the most important. Correction also, and forgiveness that goes with it, bonds people when it's done right. When it's given correctly and accepted correctly, it can bond us together. You know, in 1974, I went out into the field as a ministerial trainee. And that feast, my mom and dad came up to Canada. And I remember a conversation we had. My dad told me, he said, son, in your job, sometimes you're going to have to correct people. And he said, I've been corrected. And he said, I've been corrected strongly. I had one time, and he gave me the name of an elder that we'd grown up with. He said, I've had him poke his finger in my chest and correct me as hard as I've ever been corrected. And he said, I loved the man for it because I knew he loved me. I knew he had my best interest at heart. And he said, and I've been corrected by some people that I look back and I wondered if they weren't enjoying it a little bit. He said, there's a big difference. He said, people can tell where you're coming from. He said, most of the time, people can tell. And if you're correcting out of love, people can take it. If you're not correcting out of love, it's hard. And you might be sitting there saying, yeah, you ministers need to think about that. Well, we do. But not all correction comes from ministers. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, the Proverbs say. Sometimes we have to sit down and have heart-to-hearts with our friends. Sometimes you're the one in the best position of anybody to get through to somebody about something that may need correcting. But like everything else we do, correction must be done in love. If correction is used as a weapon, if it's to attack somebody or to vent anger or frustration at somebody, if it insults or denigrates, or we do it to, as sometimes can happen, if we correct somebody to make ourselves look better, then that erodes fellowship. That's not how God wants to see it done. In Galatians 6:1 it says, when you see someone overtaken in a fault, you who are spiritual, well, who's that? Oh, it's not me. That's the next person. No, we all ought to be spiritual. If we're not spiritual, what are we doing here? You who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. One of the biggest challenges here is to ask, lest I be tempted to what? What can the temptations be when we go to restore someone who's overtaken in a fault? Think about it. The goal is restoration. We want to see our brothers and sisters restored to a right relationship with God. But any correction we give has to be done in gentleness and love, not anger and disgust, not looking down, not in self-righteousness, because we're keeping in mind that any of us can fall prey to the temptations of sin. And as I go and correct somebody and have a heart-to-heart with them, somebody may need to come to me next week to have the same with me. You know, it's possible. Matthew 18 talks about going privately to someone who's caused offense. And what does it say is the goal? To gain your brother. That's got to be the goal. Now, boy, correction is uncomfortable. It's not easy. It's challenging. It's risky. You know that This could go the wrong way if somebody doesn't take it right. Even if I do things perfectly, that doesn't mean somebody's going to take it perfectly. And it could go down a road that, well, what if it led to problems in my relationship? Well, it could lead to problems, so I'm not going to do anything then. No, we can't do that. It's a responsibility. But when it is given and received well, boy, that can strengthen fellowship between people. That can strengthen the love between people. Have any of you ever had anybody come to you and point out something and it made you feel closer to that person? In the long run, maybe it stung a little bit, but you came away from that and maybe you gave them a hug and said, "Thanks for telling me. I appreciate knowing that." Have you ever had to do it? Well, it's a big part of life. It's also a great test of humility. And if we can keep our own pride and arrogance from getting in the way, and loving correction and loving forgiveness, that can work wonders in life. The next point. Imagine accidentally touching a hot stove with your hand and you don't feel any pain. There's a condition for that. I forget what it's called. But it's something where people have nerve damage and they cannot feel pain. You don't know your hand is being damaged. You don't instinctively remove your hand to keep things from getting worse. You take away your ability to feel pain, and you take away part of your ability to protect your body. We need to feel pain. In a similar way, it's true for the body of Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 12. 1 Corinthians 12. Verse 24. But our presentable parts have no need, but God composed the body, having given greater honor to the part which lacks it, that there should be no schism in the body, but that the members should have the same care for one another. And how's that care expressed? If one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. Or if one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it, except for those who are jealous. No, it talks about a mentality that is identifying with whatever the next person is in. This is called empathy and compassion. So the next point is that the common ground of fellowship is cultivated by growing empathy and compassion. In the body of Christ, empathy and compassion are like the network of nerves that keep us aware of how our own body is feeling. It keeps us aware of how the body is feeling. We know when we've pulled a muscle, jammed a finger, broken a bone. I stubbed my toe a couple of years ago on the bed. I thought I ought to show you the picture. No, I shouldn't. It would gross you out. The colors and the shape and everything. But it was broken. But I did not go, look at that toe. It looks like it's hurting. My face was screwed up. My eyes were shut. My body was shaking. My fists were clenched. I was hopping around that room, and I hurt all over. You've been there. It was the whole body. Even after it subsided a week later, I'm walking, and you know how I'm walking? Had to wear a sandal to work for a week. It affects the whole body. When a single part of the body hurts, the body hurts. When fellow Christians are experiencing a trial, it's good that we are aware of that trial. But you know what takes it to another level? Is when you take a little time to think, how does that make them feel? Okay, they're going through this trial, and yes, they're going through a trial. Yes, I say they're going through a trial, so I'll pray about them. But if you take some time and think, I wonder how they feel. Well, that takes you to a different level, a higher level. When They experience personal triumphs, blessings, victories in life. If we stop and think, I wonder how that makes them feel, that would tend to make us happier for them, even happier for them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep, it says in Romans 12:17. Jesus was motivated by compassion. In so many cases, there are repeated instances when he saw the multitudes who were weary and scattered, it says, like sheep having no shepherd. He had compassion. He thought about what would it be like when the blind men and the lepers cried out for healing. It says he had compassion. When he encountered the grieving widow who had lost her only son, you stop and think about what would that be like? It's more than just saying, oh yeah, she lost her son. I need to write that down and be sure and put in a word with God about her and go to God and please help her through this trial that she's in. Next. No, but to spend some time thinking about that deepens our thinking. The parables of Jesus, the parable of the unforgiving servant in Matthew 18, the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, they all revolve around compassion. Compassion in the interactions with others. So much you can cover about that. But learning to care for others, to share pain, to rejoice in their victories, to step in and help when we can, it's more than just, thinking about and caring for people. It is fellowship with Christ. It's fellowship with Christ and one another. The last point, I think it is, fellowship is cultivated by praying for one another. Talked about that yesterday. Ephesians chapter 6, Ephesians 6, 18 through 20. So many scriptures on this. Ephesians 6, 18. Praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, being watchful to this end with all perseverance and supplication for all the saints. What did Paul say? Supplicating for all the saints. And for me, he said, that utterance may be given to me, that I may open my mouth boldly to make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. There's so much to pray for about the work of the church, the condition of the world, the needing the return of Christ, the needs of other people, our brethren, Christ's brethren. Paul said, pray for all the saints. All the saints. Well, in order to pray about the needs, we have to know the needs of others, so that means taking time. This is why one of the definitions of spending time together, that's why that's so important. That's why it's a really critical part of fellowship, because you spend time together, get to know people. The more you get to know them, the deeper the prayers are. The second is sometimes we can pray about our own relationships with others, our own fellowship, making that more beneficial. Fellowship, brethren, is the lifeblood of the body of Christ. God has called us not to be individuals, not to be independent, not to be out on our own. He calls us to be with one another. And then not just to be with one another, but to have a connection. As we are working on our fellowship with God, getting to know Him better, getting to know Christ better, to follow them better, we begin to do that with other people who are doing the same as we are. We're all running parallel lives in our relationship with God, but that means we start connecting with each other. You can take these 7 points and think about them for a long time, study them. But when that ground, when that common ground, when that spiritual garden is cultivated, taken care of, weeded, fertilized, watered, nurtured, we're going to see some good produce come out of it. We will see good fruit come out of this. It is going to be something that will continue to help the church. None of these can be ignored. We can't look at any of these 7. If I said, well, pick the 3 that are important to you and work on those. Just make those part of your lives. Can't do it. You can't just pick 1 or 2 or 3 of these. We can't go and say, well, 4 out of 7 is not bad. I think I'll just work on those because I like those, but the others are too hard. It doesn't work that way. I've never planted a garden and then gone later out to it when all the plants are halfway to bearing and say, I really like my squash and tomatoes. I think I'm going to just tend them. The beets and the onions and the beans and the potatoes and the okra and the lettuce and the onions, all that, you're on your own now. When I plant a garden, I want it all to be tended, and you do too. And when God plants this spiritual garden, all of these things that make it up, he wants us to tend to all of them. Some of these will come more naturally to some than others. Some of these are harder for different ones than others. But as we really tackle each one and focus on cultivating our fellowship, that common ground that we have with God, the more we as a church will grow and be strengthened.